Do you ever open up a stunning new photo that you've captured only to zoom in and find it disappointingly blurry? It's downright heartbreaking when that perfect moment that would have looked so good printed big turns out less than perfect. So in this video I'm going to show you the commonly used focusing techniques that you should ditch for sharper images, the easy alternative technique to use for pin sharp photos when possible in a single frame, and I'll show you the foolproof method for focus stacking when it's not. To start, let me show you the most common focusing techniques that you should stop using, because they're probably a big reason your photos actually aren't sharp. Because you can see with your own eyes how unsharp this zoomed in image is. And this was after using what 99% of people are taught is the best focusing technique for landscape photography. Now this is a real example of one of my own shots from a few years ago. I was so excited knowing I'd captured some amazing shots. I couldn't wait to get them on the computer and start polishing them in editing, but that excitement was soon replaced by a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach when I zoomed in on the first one to get a closer look. The background was soft. I was doing everything right, calculating and focusing on the hyperfocal distance, which is supposed to make everything to infinity acceptably sharp. You know, surely my top-of-the-line camera and lens at the time was supposed to be sharper than what I was seeing. In fact, I knew it was because in other photos where I focused on the background was pin sharp. After I don't know how much trial and error over the years, researching, calculating, shooting, comparing, I realized the problem with the two most common landscape focusing techniques. The first, focusing on the hyperfocal distance, which is overcomplicated and can actually cause you to lose spontaneity and the ability to react to fleeting moments when shooting. It's supposed to make everything from the foreground all the way to infinity acceptably sharp. And that was it. The term acceptably sharp. What is acceptable? So I looked into it and I learned that what was deemed acceptably sharp was based on some big assumptions. We remember what happens when we assume, right? We make an ass out of you and me. So one assumption was that the photo had been printed at 8 by 10 inches and is being viewed at 12 inches from your face. So this is actually quite small, especially considering the massive resolution of today's cameras, which is far bigger than an 8 by 10 print. So let me prove it. Here's what a photo looks like when viewed at about 10 real world inches on my monitor in Photoshop. Now look very closely. You might want to go full screen if you're watching this on a computer and see what happens when I add this amount of Gaussian blur to the image. Absolutely nothing happens when viewing it at this size. Unbelievable, right? So look at the mountain in the background as I toggle this blur filter on and off. Nothing's happening. But now look what happens when I zoom into 100% zoom and then toggle it off and on. The blur filter is having a massive effect on the detail and clarity of the image at this level. And this is the problem with focus techniques that tell you that infinity will be acceptably sharp. You'll end up assuming that that means pin sharp, when in reality using hyperfocal distance will cause these issues that I've just shown you. Now a popular technique for overcoming this is to focus 1/3 of the way into the scene. Now there is a problem with that too, because while it can put the background into sharp focus, the foreground is actually more likely to suffer with softness using that method. Why? Well, because in a typical landscape scene, 1/3 of the way into the scene can actually be a really long way in the distance. And if you use a hyperfocal distance calculator, it would actually tell you that your foreground right in front of the camera is outside of the range of acceptable sharpness. So the question becomes, if you can't rely on these popular focusing techniques, how do you get the sharpest possible photo from front to back in a single frame? Well, the good news is it is actually really easy to do. It doesn't require any complicated calculations for distance, and you can start using it the very next time you take a photo. But it does come with a quick word of warning. Sometimes, depending on your choice of focal length and aperture, it's literally impossible to get a perfectly sharp photo from front to back in a single frame, because some combinations are going to have a depth of field that is way smaller than the actual real world distance from the foreground to the background of your scene. I'll show you what to do and how to get sharp images in those situations next, but first, here's my easy technique for getting the maximum possible sharpness for any given depth of field. So instead of focusing 1/3 into the scene, what I want you to do is just focus 1/3 into the foreground, because this actually gives you the best of both worlds. First, it focuses further back than the hyperfocal distance, so the background is still going to be a lot sharper, but it's not so far back that the foreground then becomes soft. Now, back to that word of warning I mentioned, because this will work as described for wide angle photography, probably up to around 35mm focal length without trouble, and it's assuming that using aperture of around f11 for maximum depth of field. However, some focal lengths and aperture combinations do actually have a smaller depth of field, so sometimes, like I said, it's impossible to get perfectly sharp images in all areas. Either the background or the foreground or both will be out of focus depending on where you're focusing. So let me show you how to get sharp images when it's impossible in a single frame. When you go beyond, say, 24 or probably closer to 35mm on your focal length and you have things that are closer to the camera, something is highly likely to be out of focus somewhere in your scene, like these examples. So how do you actually get these things in focus? So let me show you the first way, which is great when you have just one main subject in your scene, and that is to simply focus directly on that main subject, make the creative decision to accept that the other stuff can go slightly out of focus because they're not the star of the show anyway. You can even use focus as a compositional tool by making the main subject stand out more when you let other areas go out of focus, like in portrait photography, just not as blurry probably for landscapes. So there is that. Obviously, you can make a decision not to bother with focus stacking, but it doesn't actually solve the lack of sharpness. It's just a mindset shift to stop you caring about it. What if you actually have something in the foreground and something in the background, and they've got to both be pin sharp, but you're shooting at a focal length that makes it impossible? There's many ways to do it, and lots of them are either unnecessarily complicated or prone to errors. The idea, though, just as a quick overview, is to take multiple photos, each one focusing on a different part of your scene, so that across the entire range of photos you capture, everything is in focus in at least one of them. And then on the computer later, you can blend them together to keep the best bits from each one. So it sounds simple, but there are some common pitfalls you're going to want to avoid. The biggest one being that using auto blending to merge the photos together often leads to bad results because the computer has to decide which parts to blend from each photo and can get it wrong a lot of the time. Like in this example here, where you can see the line between in and out of focus bits being blended together. And there's another pitfall that can turn focus stacking into an unwieldy monster of a task, using autofocus bracketing on your camera on certain settings. Personally, I've never used autofocus bracketing, but my coaching client Andy told me that one time he tried using it and it captured an ungodly amount of images, something like 50, I don't remember the exact number. But all those images of the same scene, each one focused slightly differently. And blending that many raw files together on a computer for focus, it just ground to an absolute standstill. So to overcome these pitfalls, let me show you my simple approach to focus stacking that's going to get you sharp results quickly and easily. Step 1 begins in camera. First, compose your shot on a tripod and then set your aperture to between f8 and f14, which is where the sweet spot for most lenses in terms of maximum lens sharpness and maximum depth of field is. Using a lower f number results in a smaller depth of field, and a higher f number lenses tend to be softer in, even if they're in focus. So if you're not sure what your lens's ideal setting is, just stick with f11 probably. Then you're going to focus on the main subject in your scene and take your first shot. If the main subject was in the background, then take another shot focusing on the middle distance, and then a third shot focusing on the foreground. Or if your subject was in the middle distance, then take your second shot focusing on the furthest thing in the scene, and so on. The end goal is to have the foreground, middle ground, and background covered with a sharp shot for each. Now, if you're shooting at 50mm and under, you probably won't need any more than these 3 shots. However, one important thing to remember is that the more you zoom in, the more likely you are to need some extra shots, because at longer focal lengths, the depth of field gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So this means when capturing a landscape in telephoto, you might focus on the foreground, middle ground, and background, but the low depth of field will mean that parts in between those areas are still going to be out of focus. And when that happens, you can either choose to let something be creatively out of focus, like I mentioned earlier, or you can just take extra shots focusing at smaller intervals from front to back. But for now, let me show you the easy and probably most effective way to take your focus bracketed shots and blend them together to make one sharp result. Now, if you opened your images from Lightroom directly into Photoshop with Open As layers, then they're already in layers within one document. You might want to align them now by following these steps. Click on the top layer, then shift-click on the bottom layer, then select Edit, Auto Align Layers from the menu. Select Auto and then click OK. So now we've got all the images lined up, the fun part really begins. First, zoom into 100% zoom level and move around the image to make sure what should be sharp is sharp for this top layer, which for this example is the main subject here. Now move the layer that has the sharp background above this layer in the layers panel. Look at the background to confirm it's sharp. Now toggle this layer's visibility off and on a few times to judge just how much sharper it is than the layer underneath. Now if there is no difference, then great news, you can throw this layer away. Otherwise, you can follow these steps to take the sharp parts from the background focused layer and blend them into the subject focused layer. So first, add a layer mask to this top layer, and then invert the layer mask by selecting the layer mask and pressing Command or Control and I on the keyboard, and then select the brush tool with a 0% hardness edge on 100% opacity and white as the brush foreground color. Then click on the layer mask again to make sure it's selected. From here, brush directly into the background of the scene, and as you do this, you'll notice that you're revealing the sharp parts of this layer that were previously covered by the black layer mask. So you're essentially brushing sharpness into the image at this point. Now, once you've done this for the background, all you need to do is repeat the process for the foreground layer. So move the foreground focused layer to the top, zoom in. Does it make the foreground appear sharper than the first exposure? If no, delete it. If yes, add a layer mask to it, invert the layer mask, then brush with a white brush to reveal the sharp foreground. Now the thing is, capturing a perfectly sharp image is just step one of what goes into capturing amazing landscapes. It doesn't matter how sharp your photos are if you're making any one of these 5 other big mistakes that I see photographers making all the time. So to see what they are and how to stop them destroying your photo's potential, watch this next video.